Welcome everyone. I'm very excited to be here. This is, as Jeff said, my first webinar, so I'm a little nervous, but definitely excited. So my presentation today is putting the flesh on the bones. Now what does that mean? To me it means concentrating your research on one individual at a time. Most of us conduct research to get names, dates, and places, the answers to the questions who, when, and where, so that we can expand our family tree. But I believe you can explore two other questions which I quite honestly think are far more interesting. Why and how? Why did our ancestors act the way that they did? And what and who influenced them? And also, how did that person have an impact on other relatives, especially you and me? I also believe we can do some context setting to understand more about the locations where our family lived and also the events that were occurring around our relatives. A couple of caveats up front. I'll say I'm compulsive, and I'll argue that many genealogists are. I've been called far worse things, but I'll definitely acknowledge and agree that I'm compulsive. I'm also incredibly blessed and lucky to have found everything I'm going to show you today. Admittedly, it took a lot of hard work to find what I found, but also there was a lot of luck involved. So not every one of you will be able to find this much information about certainly all your relatives, possibly not even any of your relatives, but I'm here to prove to you that it is possible to do so. Furthermore, this is not a one-shot deal. I've used this technique and process over and over again with other individuals that I have researched. Now, I got into genealogy for all the wrong reasons. I lost my parents to cancer 20 to 22 years ago, and one of the big projects I had to take care of very early on was to sell the house that my brother and I grew up in New York. And I found two things of interest in the house in New York. One was a box of postcards, and this is an example of those postcards. They were all in either Russian or Cyrillic script, as well as Yiddish script. This particular postcard is addressed to my father's mother, Fanny Gilman. This is Cyrillic script, and it's addressed to her where she was living in Belarus in a town called Smorgon. The other thing that I found was a family tree that my father had shown me when I was a junior in college, and quite honestly at that time I wasn't ready for this information, and I didn't have the heart to tell my father, gee, this is boring. But having lost both of my parents to cancer, I had a newfound interest in my family origins, and I took this tree and I ran with it. Now, my father had done a great job in researching his side of the family, and while I knew my mother's parents, I really didn't know that much more about my mother's side of the family. So that's where I also furthered my research. So let me set the stage. One of the very first records I found in my journey in the genealogy world was this Soundex index card from the 1920 U.S. Federal Census. Back in the Jurassic Age, about 15 years ago, we still had to use microfilm readers and microfilm and a little bit of elbow grease to move that microfilm forwards and backwards. So this index card has a few things, and in and of itself, this card is pretty innocuous. It's pretty tame, nothing exciting going on. It lists my great-grandfather, Isaac Spear, in the upper left-hand corner. It lists my great-grandmother, Ida. It lists my grandfather, Sidney, and Sidney's two siblings, Lillian and David. What's of most importance on this card is the fact that somehow the census taker got the impression that my great-grandfather, Isaac, was born in New York. Hold on to that thought for a minute or two. The next record I found was the birth certificate for my grandfather, Sidney. According to this document, his father, Isaac Spear, was born not in New York, but in Hanley, Staffordshire, England. So right off the bat, I was a bit confused. I had a great-grandfather born in New York and Hanley, Staffordshire, England. What's also of note on this birth certificate is the date of birth of my grandfather, Sidney, May 30th, 1895. Hold on to that date for a second because I'm going to have you do some calculation shortly. I want to show you my great-grandfather's beautiful handwriting. It's one of the reasons why my mother was so enamored with her grandfather. Aside from his speaking capabilities, which I'll explore more shortly, he had this beautiful flowing handwriting. And in fact, probably because of this, my mother took up calligraphy. The next document I found was the marriage certificate for my great-grandparents. Here is Isaac Spear once again. He's living at 267 20th Street in Brooklyn. That's an important address I want you to remember for a little bit as well. He married a woman by the name of Ida Tarshis, also living at 267 20th Street in Brooklyn. Now, according to this document, Isaac Spear was not born in New York. He was not born in Hanley, Staffordshire, England. He was born in London, England. So things were getting really confusing before they're becoming clear for me. What's also of interest on this document, but a little bit difficult to see, is the date of the wedding itself. It occurred either on the 13th or the 18th of November. And if you calculate the number of months from November of 1894 to May of 1895, when my grandfather was born, you'll understand that that was 6 months, not a full term of 9 months. So it's possible that my grandfather Sidney was a preemie baby, but odds are, given what I'm going to show you, that something else was going on. So I went looking elsewhere. I found this Soundex index card from the 1900 U.S. Federal Census showing an Isaac Spear. There were not that many people in New York in 1900 with that name. According to this document, this Isaac Spear claimed to have been born in Pennsylvania, a fourth location. Furthermore, this person was enumerated as an inmate at the famous prison known as Sing Sing in New York. So now I had an Isaac Spear, a relative of mine, who was born in 4 different locations. Even Harry Houdini, who could get out of handcuffs and locked trunks, could not figure out a way to be born in 4 different locations, but somehow my great-grandfather Isaac Spear did. After the fact, I would prove that Isaac and Ida were not living together in 1900. Here is another part of the 1900 U.S. Federal Census showing Max Tarshis, my great-great-grandfather, and in the lower left-hand corner I've just highlighted Ida, my great-grandmother, and her sister Florence, who I'll talk about shortly, and they were living as a nuclear family at 267 20th Street in Brooklyn. This happens to be the death certificate for my great-grandmother Ida, and according to this document, her husband's name was not Isaac, but Joseph. So now I had a great-grandfather who was born in 4 different locations and went by 2 different first names. Things were getting much more confusing before they were getting clearer. So I tried to make sense out of this. I created a spreadsheet. I listed all the documents that I showed you as well as some others, and I tried to line things up. So in the name used column, third from the left, we see that I found many different documents with the name Isaac Spear, but also almost a similar amount of documents with the name Joseph Spear. Several different birth locations: London, Hanley, Staffordshire, England, Pennsylvania, and New York, different addresses and occupations which seem to line up. Now, the rumor in my family was that my great-aunt Florence was a famous stage actress. So I went to the New York Public Library at Lincoln Center, which has file folders for people who have been successful in show business. And while I did not exactly find the file folder for my great-aunt Florence, I did find a folder for her husband, Harry First, who was also very successful in vaudeville. In that file folder was an article from Variety magazine. You see the right-hand column catches her husband, talks about my great aunt Florence. Her stage name was Florence Headley, which is shown in the second line, and she accuses Harry First, her husband, of fooling around on the side. A week later, in Variety magazine, Harry comes back and he says, well, I'm only human. I'll read this to you. I should like to state that I never laid hand on my wife in anything but kindness. My wife is a very high-strung woman, and under stress of excitement, she is very apt to beat her head against the stone wall. I have always provided comfortably for her and the baby, and have receipts for money orders showing that I have sent her not less than an average of $800 a month for their maintenance while I've been on tour. The whole difficulties are due to outside meddlers to whom she has been listening. Our troubles date back to 2 years ago when I was away for 9 months, when I had a little theatrical, quote-unquote, affair. You know how these things are when a man is away on the road for a protracted length of time. We are only human. I had a calling. At some point, I remember the story from my childhood, which was so clear it was as if the story happened yesterday. I remember going to my grandparents' house, and for reasons I can't remember, I teased my grandmother that should I be a bad boy that day, which I never was, she'd have to throw me away in Sing Sing. Now, my grandmother was pretty alarmed by those words, and she pulled me aside and very sternly said, please do not use the word Sing Sing in front of your grandfather. That will piss him off. I don't think she used the exact words piss off, but I'm paraphrasing and bringing the terminology up into the 21st century. I also heard an internal voice that either told me, come to New York or go to New York. There's something here you had to find. So I thought that meant I really should call up Sing Sing Prison. So I called up the prison, and I asked if they had the old records. And they said, no, we do not have the old records for Sing Sing, but you might want to contact the New York State Archives in Albany. They have the records. So I called up Albany, and the other person on the line said, we have the records. I said, can you look up something for me? And the person said, well, when was he admitted? And the only thing I could do was to give a range. I said he had to be admitted between 1895, when my grandfather was born, and 1900, when someone by the same name was behind bars in the census. The guy said, that's too much work for us. We can't do that. But if you want, we will get the record books out, and you can come and take a look at them. I said, please get them out. I'm taking the next American Airlines flight across the country to see these records. Furthermore, this guy told me that in any given year in that time frame, there are about 300 people admitted to the prison each year. So I multiplied 300 people per year by 5 years. That was 1,500 records I had to go through. I gave myself 1 day to answer the question, was this my great-grandfather or not? So I divided 1,500 records by 8 hours that the archives would be open in 1 day by 60 minutes per hour. That turned out to be 3 records per minute, or 1 record every 20 seconds. This could be done. So I decided I'd give myself 1 day to find out the answer, was this my great-grandfather? And in exactly 1 hour, I found the following record from 1897. This shows an Isaac Spear, alias Herbert Edward Spear, a third name. He was received from the Kings County, i.e. Brooklyn court. He was sentenced on September 27, 1897 on charges of bigamy. He was sentenced by the Honorable William B. Hurd, the judge in the case. He was arrested by Detective Shark of the NYPD. This all took place in the 5th Police Precinct of Brooklyn. According to this document, Isaac was born in England, which is true. He was 23 years of age. He was an entry clerk as well as a trolley car conductor. That's how he could get across Brooklyn so easily between the 2 wives. He was of medium complexion. He had blue eyes. He had medium-colored hair, which in those days meant he was a redhead. Stature was 5'5½". He weighed 131 pounds. He could read. He could write. His habits including being temperate, which meant he did not use alcohol. He did not use tobacco.
for reasons unclear to me. He lists himself not as